Welcome back to Skills Measured Area number 5, Monitoring and Backup of Azure Resources. In this functional group, we'll discuss the following. 5.1, Monitor Resources by using Azure Monitor. 5.2, Implement Backup and Recovery. Let's review our monitoring options. It's critical to monitor your systems closely to identify any problems or attacks before they can affect your users. So, Azure Monitor is a service used for collecting, combining, and analyzing data from different sources. Azure Monitor also integrates with solutions like Azure Security Center, which provides a service that manages the security of your infrastructure from a centralized location. Use Azure Security Center to monitor the security of your workloads, whether they're on premises or in the cloud, as well as Azure Application Insights. And Application Insights allows us to monitor the availability, the performance, and the usage of our web applications, whether they're hosted on premises or in Azure Cloud. You can add monitoring solutions to Azure Monitor for any applications and services that you use. A little bit more about Azure Monitor. Azure Monitor maximizes the availability and the performance of your applications, your service, and your services by delivering a comprehensive solution for collecting and analyzing and acting on this telemetry. So we know Azure Monitor provides a great service to correlate infrastructure issues with Azure Monitor virtual machines and containers, to drill into data using log analytics, where we'll store those events and logs, application insights for troubleshooting, maybe some detection, some automated actions incorporated in how we manage our alerting criteria and resolve those alerts, as well as thinking through the visualization of the data that we collect, making it real, having it tie into a customized dashboard, which we know how to configure now in Azure Portal. We're going to use KQL or Kusto query language, which allows us, with a specific, very easily human readable context, syntax that is, that allows us to pull in logs and metrics into our log analytics workspace and build out queries to review all of the items that we have saved there. So think about the differences. You should understand by now the differences between metrics and logs. Metrics, numeric data, and logs would be any value that isn't considered a numerical one. Think about some of the integration points. So on the left here, we see various data resources or resources that could create various points or data points. And based on these sources, whether they're Azure specific or customized sources, they will be divided into either logs or metrics, segregated in that way, and then input or injected into a variety of offerings under the Azure Monitor umbrella. So understand some of the wonderful dependencies that you can create and collaborate with, so we can inject our data into a log analytics workspace that allows us to analyze metrics or analyze logs. We can respond, we can correlate and view some of those rich insights with visualization. So these components are complementary and allow us to view a full spectrum of management in Azure Monitor. We mentioned dashboards. Dashboards allow us that visualization component so that we can view our saved logs and find and correlate IT operational data within our organization. So to create a custom dashboard in Azure, as well as changing your views, for instance, or creating a specific, maybe you have a specific language or that you like to or prefer to see in Azure Portal, that's customizable. Maybe I want to fly out a dock or dock my individual blades and views. Maybe I want to change from a trend of an Azure theme to a dark theme in Azure, light to dark. I'm able to do all that customization in the settings panel of my portal, which we remember from exploring the portal in previous learnings. So I have the ability to create dashboards. I can share them out. Important that you understand not just how to create them, but how to integrate those dashboards or export them, download them, um, create role-based access control or permissions around them to see who can view that information, and very quickly have something that's accessibly visually for your environment. Another key item for creation of alerts is to think about actions surrounding those alerts. You have a wide variety of range of options for the Azure Monitor platform that will allow you to create alerts from your Log Explorer, your Metrics Explorer, meaning that we can review some of these built-in queries and structure alerts directly from the query. That's pretty neat. So we know that from previous learnings that we can use the embedded built-in queries or create our own. And from the KQL or Query Custo language that is embedded in this interface, we're able to structure some details and define definitions for what we want to trigger. Basically, how do we want to trigger um, a notification or some customized response for alerts? Understand those. And when we think about alerts, it's really important to remember for the exam that alerts will require compliance, right? So we're tying this back into governance. We're tying this back into um, action groups. I don't know if that's a concept that rings a bell for you, but once we establish an alert, we have to establish a priority for that alert. What severity is that alert? Is there going to be a custom action uh, to include a function app, a logic app, some other trigger, or an action group? Who's involved in that group? Is that going to be your key stakeholders? How can they be notified? Through email, through fax? No, the fax is not an option for an action group. So you should know those differences and be able to dig deeper into alerts and compliance as well. When you configure Azure Monitor, you can configure monitoring for a variety of sources to include virtual machines, compute resources, Azure storage, networks itself, as well as applications. And Application Insights is a feature under the Azure Monitor tool that has a connection point to many different tools that allow you to analyze and monitor telemetry. It monitors application performance and also management for live websites as well. So a variety uh, of fields, a variety of inputs to include request rates, AJAX calls for web pages, host diagnostics for Azure or Docker, and customize events and metrics too. Don't forget that for anything in Azure Monitor, there is usually an accompanying modification or customization that makes it real for your use case. Another key component within this functional group 5 is around backups and data protection in the sense that every time we create a resource, we want to think through the life cycle of that resource. We want to think through um, how we can, in a cost-effective, secure, simple way, establish some recovery if we need it. In most cases, we do for the life cycle of that resource. So Azure Backup allows you a platform within Azure that would give you a way to back up either on-premises workloads, things like your IaaS, your infrastructures as a service virtual machines, and some other resources as well. With unlimited data transfer in a secure fashion, You can also have application consistent backups. You should know what that means or look it up. Uh, do we need to define, and this is going to be a governance decision, a short or long-term data term for storage? And at this point, you should know how long you can store objects within Azure Backup. That would be another point that you might see on the exam. What's that retention period look like? What about automatic storage management for that backup uh, data point? Meaning that Azure, once you choose a backup option like a recovery services vault within a specific region, will manage the underlying storage for that or those data points within that vault. So you have options, remember, for managing the schedule, for restores, and Azure as a platform as a service offering will do some of that legwork for you. So as a learner who is sitting for this exam, very key to understand which portions of a PaaS service Azure is going to use to utilize, what part of that PaaS service is going to be enacted on for you. Another key component of Azure Backup Service is thinking about recovery points. Do you understand RTO, RPO, uh, recovery time objectives, RPO, recovery point objects? Might see a few questions that ask you the differences between those, right? So Azure Backup as a service uh, it sits on some Azure storage as its underlying component for management, but does allow you to create what's called recovery vaults, gives you backup policies that allow you to start creating some definitions around how you manage what goes into these recovery services vaults, does allow you using backup agents to manage on-premises backups to Azure itself. um, and you do have some integration with things like Azure Monitor for insights, for auditing, for reporting, as well as authentication integration with things like Azure Active Directory. There is a slight difference between when you would use Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery. So let's discuss those. As an organization, you may need to adopt a business continuity plan or have some disaster recovery strategy, some BCDR embedded to keep your data safe, your applications, your workloads online. Um, when you have a planned or unplanned outage, know the difference between your, since we're talking about data protection, unplanned versus planned scenarios. uh, which one of these would support maybe live migrations? That may come up as a question for your alt and update domains. For instance, for a virtual machine workload or a compute resource, this might be relevant. Um, so just some things to tie in, discussion of some items that may tie in, some thoughts around Azure Backup and what you can do and provide, what does it provide you resiliency for? Azure Backup would give you support for application consistent backups for both Windows or Linux VMs, right? So to give you another mechanism, not just for managing the instances over fault and update domains of your virtual machines, but also protecting the data that resides on your virtual machine instances. And that data would either live in a storage account or so that's one replication strategy, but you also want to think about having application consistent backups that live in Azure Backup. So we're layering on these pieces, not just of managing the instance and the storage, but also creating a landscape for recovery of that data. So Azure Site Recovery is slightly different tool, protects your virtual machine from major outages and disaster scenarios where a whole region is going to have an outage, right? So we're talking about one whole region. This is why we have regional pairs, because if my virtual machine lives in an east region and is paired with the West region by default, and one goes out, usually the other is still going to be up and running to create that business continuity. And if I need to fail over to another region, what does that look like? Site recovery allows replication of workloads running on physical or virtual machines from that primary site to that secondary location. So, do you understand what that failover process looks like? Maybe you should, read through Azure documentation or Microsoft documentation to familiarize yourself with what the failover to secondary region looks like, how to access apps there, how to fill back. You can fill back to the primary region once it's up and running again. So let's explore some backup policies. And before we do so, we should think about some of the use cases for Azure Backup. When would you use Azure Backup over Azure When would you use Azure Backup Server over the recovery service? That would be a good example of comparison and contrast in your exam that you should be prepared for. Let's explore backup policies. An organization might need to adapt this business continuity strategy. We know that if we choose to use recovery services, it will contribute to this strategy of managing our backup and unplanned outages once they occur. So with Azure Backup policies, we know that we can start thinking about the mapping of services, the resources that we would like to save or have some recovery points for, and thinking about how to incorporate the managing of these policies maybe through an automated fashion. We can configure backup policies in Azure Portal, absolutely, but we have the capability to, as we see on the right-hand side, to use CLI, Azure Command Line Interface, to map our policy requirements, the name of our policy, the type in JSON, declarative syntax, JavaScript object notation, declarative definitions for each one of these policies, the name of the resource group where our recovery services will live. So these are some of the required parameters that we just explored for creating a backup policy using CLI. And the syntax should be familiar at this point because you're gearing to go to take the exam. So Azure CLI as well as PowerShell should be very familiar to you, at least in syntax. So you may see a question on the exam that says, drag and drop the appropriate placement or words to complete the required parameters for a backup policy. And in here, of course, you would have some answers that make no sense, and you would choose the correct association to drag and drop into place. Okay. Also, understand retention periods for defaults, that is. So Azure retains backup data for 14 days, for additional days, and this would be known as soft delete. So during this period, it's possible to recover deleted backups of items by using an undelete a function. So be familiar with this undelete option as well as a soft delete enablement, which is there by default. When performing a backup and restore operation using Azure Backup, it's probably a great idea to remember some of the steps involved. Let's review those briefly here. So keep in mind when I want to perform a backup or you want to perform a backup and restore, there are a few options or items that need to be intact. First, we need to check Azure permissions to ensure that we have correct permissions to our Azure Key Vault, or excuse me, Recovery Services Vault. Ensure that we get proper role-based access control. Check the subscription to make sure that we have enough resources in the target region, that we're able to create this based on our subscription limits. And we know that if we are maxing or haven't maxed our limits, then we may be able to open a support ticket to adjust those in some cases, some supported cases. We prepare the virtual machine that we want to replicate and do that by ensuring that we have outbound connectivity, the latest root certificates, install the latest version of the operating system to the virtual machine, or ensure that it's probably properly maintained and patched, right, for security. Create a recovery services vault in the region where we would like to have that virtual machine live, or where we'd like to collect that data. So create a recovery services vault in any region except in the source region, which you have the virtual machine in. We want to create it in a region outside of, except in the source region from which you want to replicate VMs. Enable site recovery in the vault. We know that site recovery, we should know that by now, allows us to plan for workload transition to another region, right? And then we enable VM replication. So go to the site recovery page to enable this, select the virtual machines we want to enable for this disaster recovery step. And then finally, there are some other key details that you want to review. This is a shorter functional group or objective domain, meaning up to 15%, I believe, would be the number of questions asked in this category. But you may want to also think through, can you step through all of the components or steps for, or sequentially for creating that recovery services vault? When do you use a backup vault? How do you manage and configure backup policy? Are you able to perform the steps that we just covered for backup and restore operations for Azure Backup? When would you use specific agents to support Azure Backup? These are all key details that you'd like to know for the exam. Agents for your virtual machines. Um, when would you use a bare metal approach to, if you want to back up bare metal for on premises? Do you know how to do that? Probably a good idea to read up on all of those items. And lastly, let's talk about Azure Site Recovery and the steps involved to fail over to a secondary region. We know from our study that anytime we add a resource to a region, Azure has already allocated its regional twin, its pair. So there's already establishment of a secondary region, in which case Azure manages that failover component unless maybe for Azure Storage, you have other replication strategies that you've built in. You're not necessarily going to manage that secondary region unless you have Azure Site Recovery enabled and you're interested in having replication to that secondary region. So think about we talked about replication of objects. That works very similar as a concept for site recovery as well. We are going to have a process. We have a process which Azure uses to essentially take that workload resource and replicate it to as an object to a new region. If you would like to test this out, there is documentation that steps through how to enable replication for an Azure virtual machine by selecting the virtual machine that you'd like to replicate, verify the settings, ensuring that the replication status is modified correctly, you test the deployment, um, and there are a few other details that are key to note before you fail over. But once you have that planning together, you can clean up your resources after your test and disable replication on that primary region. So this would be an example of a failover test, and you may see a question that asks you to order sequentially things like, um, in which order would you perform the following? Right? So that's a very light touch. If you'd like to find additional reading, please do so. Go to Azure Docs and view the failover process. But for the scope of the AZ-104, probably important that you understand object replication, understand secondary regions as a default construct for failover. And yeah, I think you'll be fine for the exam. I think you'll be fine. Let's practice with some knowledge check. Question number 1. You need to search through the Azure Monitor logs to find some records. Which query language would you use? Number 1, SQL. Number 2, KQL. 3, SLogic. Or 4, LDAP. We know the correct answer to be KQL, Kusto Query Language. Do you need to be an expert in Kusto Query Language? No, but you do need to understand how to modify existing built-in queries, where to go. That would be maybe if you're dabbling in log analytics, you have that editor feature that will allow you to use built-in queries or modify your own. So it's very human readable, no fear there. Next question. You're responsible for creating a disaster recovery plan for your data center. You must be able to recreate virtual machines from scratch. This includes the operating system, its configuration settings, and patches. Which of the following provide a bare metal backup for your VMs? So here we have option 1, Azure Backup, the Mars agent. 2, enable disk snapshots. 3, Azure Site Recovery. Or 4, Azure Backup Server. The correct answer here is Azure Backup Server. This allows us to provide bare metal capabilities in our environment. So here is a great example of understanding the difference. We can perform all of these in the Azure environment. The how is how you want to practice for the exam. Understand the difference between Mars and Azure Backup. One is an agent that you add to specific workloads that gives you the ability to manage a subset of backup scenarios. For things like Azure Bare Metal, well, for Bare Metal Backup, you will want to create a virtual server or maybe an on-premises version of this Azure Backup Server that will facilitate said backup. So there are some differences between Mars as an agent or the backup server, although very closely related. And by now, you've noted those differences and you're well prepared to practice for the exam. Let's review what we've covered in this functional group. In functional group 5, we've discussed monitoring options using Azure Monitor, as well as a variety of tools that integrate with Azure Monitor as a service. We spoke about dashboards and creating visualizations, alerts, and actions. Know those actions, know what you can do with action groups. We also talked about monitoring different sources to include things like virtual machines, storage accounts, when to use your network backups or Azure Backup and Azure Backup Recovery Services vaults, vaults, excuse me. We also talked about managing Azure Backup Policy and thinking through our disaster recovery scenarios for Azure Site Recovery. We certainly hope you've enjoyed this exam prep session. Thank you for watching our exam prep videos for AZ-104. We covered how to manage Azure identities and governance, implement and manage storage, deploy and manage Azure compute resources, configure and manage virtual networking, and finally, monitor and backup Azure resources. Now that we have revisited these topics, I wish you the very best for your attempt at the exam. And for more information, please visit aka.ms/AZ-104-exam.